Ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor to bring up our next speaker. Our next speaker is Grover Proctor, who will be speaking on the Raleigh Call. Grover Proctor offers evidence that Lee Oswald tried to reach the CIA for protection after his arrest, and how the Dallas police hid the truth about Oswald from the American people. Ladies, if you would give it up for Grover Proctor.
Well, good afternoon, and thanks for sticking around for this. I have just a couple of personal words to say first, and Judith is in one of her modes of going out and ruling the world and is not sitting in this room right now, I don't think. But you all join me, I know, in congratulating her, being grateful to her, and having all sorts of respect for her for everything that she has done all these years. Yeah. She and I first came together back in roughly 1995 when she was beginning the ideas of the book that became Me and Lee, and somebody had said to her, well, contact Grover and he'll help you if you can. And I did if I could, to the extent that I could, and put her in touch with some people that I knew, and sure enough, about 10 years later, the book came out, and we were all amazed. So thank you, Judith, for that, and thank you for letting me be a small part of it. I also want to thank, on what I think today may be a very special day, all the way around, I want to thank my wife, who is sitting here. She came in yesterday. She has not followed the case except through going around and watching all of my lectures and proofreading all of my manuscripts. But has been a loyal supporter, has let me go out and play so many times, and has sat through countless retellings of the Raleigh Call and all the other things that I've talked about over the years. As a really good sport, as you'll see when I ask her to stand up, a lovely lady, talented, great writer herself. Adrienne, thank you very much. And the last thing is I want to, I do what I've never done before. I want to dedicate this lecture that I'm giving today to someone that I lost last year. He was a dear friend. He was a colleague. He was my mentor in the writing and publishing business. Bernie Reeves, whose picture I've just put up, died in February of 2018. He was 70 years old. He was exactly 4 years older than me. So we went to the same high school and graduated from the same college, but we were never at either one at the same time. He started Spectator magazine, which was actually the venue in which most of my early writings, including the Raleigh Call, came out. He was also the founder and editor of the Triangle Business Journal, the Raleigh Metro magazine, and some of you may have actually attended one of his best things that he did toward the end of his life, which was he founded and ran the Raleigh Spy Conference every year. You want to read the history of the Spy Conference. I was told by my brother-in-law who went there one year, he says, well, old spies never die, they just get together and sell each other books. I said, been there, done that. The main thing I want to say about Bernie, other than I miss him as a friend and as a mentor, is he made me a better writer. And as if that weren't enough, he introduced me to the lady who became my wife. So thank you, Bernie, for all of that. The story presented here and that I have talked about actually 2 years ago at the same conference has to do with dating back to the mid-'70s when Senator Richard Schweiker told the world that we don't know what happened, but we know that Oswald had intelligence connections, and everywhere you look with him, there are the fingerprints of intelligence. And that's the sort of running subtitle that goes through all of the Raleigh Call. It never actually comes up and hits in a way that you can say, ah, yes, look, here's the connection. But it's always there. And let me give you just a little hint, and we'll fill in that subtext as we go along. First of all, it involves, and here's the story in a nutshell that we're going to tell today. It involves an incident that happened in the Dallas jail on the evening of Saturday, November 23rd, '63, Oswald had been incarcerated for over 24 hours at that time. He had no way to know it, but he had just hours, of course, left to live. After having made and attempted to make several phone calls during the day, and I'll tell you all about that later, that's kind of new to my presentation, he, in the late evening, let it be known that he wanted to make another phone call. And as we will find out, the person that he wanted to call lived in Raleigh, North Carolina, hence the name of the whole topic here. And he had a very special background that, once it became known, kind of made the difference between turning this into an oh ho hum kind of little deal and oh my goodness, does this have any real relevance for letting us know what happened, who Oswald was associating himself with, and did he have intelligence connections of his own. After the House Assassinations Committee, which is the only governmental committee that ever, or investigation that ever looked into the Raleigh Call, for reasons, again, we'll tell you, the chief counsel, Robert Blakey, had this to say about the story. He said that the facts that they uncovered are real, substantiated, very troublesome, and very deeply disturbing. So the story you're going to hear is, in fact, all of those things if you let it be. And he said it raises questions that remain unanswered, makes inferences which are wholly and ultimately inconclusive, and therefore is an unanswerable mystery. So you'll leave here knowing all the questions and a few hints of answers today. It's Saturday night, as I said, November 23rd. Oswald has 12 hours left to live. And we focus in on the time somewhere after 10 p.m. Dallas time. At about 10:15, 10:30, 43-year-old telephone switchboard operator by the name of Mrs. Alveda Treon reports to work early, somewhere between 30 and 45 minutes early, because she's been asked by one of her co-workers if she will come in early so that the co-worker could leave early, and so she did, which put her there when she normally would not have been. As soon as Mrs. Treon found her place at the switchboard, where she was sitting toward one end and her supervisor was sitting toward the other, a lady by the name of Mrs. Louise Swinney. You're going to hear those two names a lot. It's going to be easy to confuse them, but Mrs. Treon is the one that we get all this information from, but Mrs. Swinney was her supervisor and actually is the one who talked with Lee Oswald on the phone. As soon as Mrs. Treon sat down, Mrs. Swinney told her that there would be two men. She wasn't sure whether she said, whether Mrs. Swinney said Secret Service, homicide, or what, coming to the switchboard room to listen in on a call. They told her that they would be taking Lee Oswald to a telephone to let him make a call, and these two men would be there to listen in. About 10 minutes later, according to Mrs. Treon, and by now we're after 10:30, that will become significant again. So sometime between 10:30 and 11 o'clock, in fact, the little light comes on the switchboard, and it's from the jail area. And so both ladies, who are now, of course, sitting there waiting for this to happen, they both plug into their area of the switchboard at exactly the same time. So they're both on the call. And it's Mrs. Treon, again, the lady that we get most of our information from, who says, "Number, please." And at that point, the person on the other end, who was identified as Lee Oswald, began to talk about a phone call that he wanted to make and to give information about that. Mrs. Swinney, being the senior person, stepped in at that point and handled the call. Now, it's going to be very important for you to remember one detail, and that is both ladies stayed plugged in, so in their earpieces, both of them heard everything that Oswald said about who he wanted to call. Mrs. Swinney actually did the work and was writing down this information expecting to make the call. Mrs. Treon was sitting there taking notes because she thought this is history, and had been asked by her daughter that if anything happened related to the assassination, make a note of it so that the family could remember it, have a souvenir. So she was parallel notes to Mrs. Swinney about everything that Oswald had to say. Mrs. Treon says that she was dumbfounded at what happened next, and here is in fact what happened. As soon as Oswald had given all the information that he was going to give about the call that he wanted to make, he was put on hold by Mrs. Swinney, which meant that Mrs. Treon didn't have anything to listen to anymore, and she plugs into where these two men are. They had come in, they'd been put into an adjacent room so that they could listen in, and plugs into the phone that was there for them and proceeds to tell them the information about the call. Mrs. Treon can't hear any of this as to what's coming back from those two men, so she's sitting there waiting, and this is what made her become dumbfounded. At some point, Mrs. Swinney visibly became nervous and was having a hard time breathing and was not responding well. She closed the connection to the two men in the other room and just sat there. And Mrs. Treon was really scared for what was going to be, what was happening and why she was reacting that way, and was dumbfounded when Mrs. Swinney went back onto the line with Oswald and said, "I'm sorry, no one answered at that call." She had never tried to place the call, leaving us to guess and to wonder and have, I think, a good reason to suspect that she'd been told by these two men, "Don't place the call, tell them it didn't go through." The two men came out, they thanked them, they left. Let's find out about that call, because yes, Mrs. Treon was successful in writing down all the information that Oswald had said. She put it down actually on a phone slip that they have to have in the Dallas jail at that time for accounting purposes. It didn't all just route to a computer that kept this information. It all had to be written down. And if someone is going to make a long distance call, or in Oswald's case, a long distance collect call, that number is written down on a little slip of paper. All the information, including the time, is put in there. It goes to accounting, and accounting knows where the billing is supposed to happen. She took one of those blank slips, and she wrote down all of Oswald's information and kept it, and it was in her possession, and no one else outside of her family knew that she had it for another 5 years, and this is what it looked like. And let's just go through the various elements on here. Top, collect call. Obviously, Oswald had no way for paying or anything, so everything out of the jail that was long distance had to be a collect call. It comes from the jail. It says the place is the jail. The person, Lee Harvey Oswald, they were still calling him by his three names, to Raleigh, North Carolina. The person called John Hurt, and over to the right, 2 telephone numbers, and underneath that, so that she would remember who she was working with, Mrs. Treon wrote Mrs. Swinney's name under that. She was not trying to forge Mrs. Swinney's signature. She just wanted to remember that particular time. Wrote area code 919 in the lower left. Having grown up in Raleigh, North Carolina, I immediately, when the first time I saw this slip, said, "That looks familiar." Oh yeah, that was my area code. And then after it was all over with, she put 2 codes in there, DA and CA. DA, which is what they would write if the call didn't answer, and CA, that the call was canceled. So, when the House Assassinations Committee got this information and did the investigation that's really the thing that gives us all the other information other than this particular slip that we have today, this is what they wrote in their report. Mrs. Treon stayed on the line. She said she was therefore able to hear everything Oswald said, and she is sure he asked for the name John Hurt and gave 2 numbers. She said that as she listened, she wrote the information down on a regular telephone call slip. However, since Mrs. Swinney actually handled the call, Mrs. Treon signed her, Mrs. Swinney's name to the slip she intended to keep as a souvenir. She said that the notations DA and CA did in fact stand for did not answer and cancel because it actually never went through. Mrs. And so the upshot of that kind of repeating of all the evidence is that, in fact, in their report, the staff members who did the investigation into the Raleigh Call for the House Assassinations Committee came away believing that it was true, that it happened, that Mrs. Treon had absolutely no reason to lie, and her accompanying documentation, which includes 2 active and real telephone numbers from the time, add a lot of credence to the fact that this happened, even though, like Blakey, they couldn't explain why all of it was going on. So, in fact, how do we know what we know today? What did the House Assassinations Committee uncover is the next thing. And in some writing that I've done, I'll just read this. I think this summarizes the questions that go into to this that we want to try and figure out. The first thing that they found out was that John Hurt, with that top telephone number, area code 919-834-7430, was, as I indicated, a live, real telephone number in Raleigh, North Carolina, registered to a man named John Hurt, lived at 201 West Hillsborough Street in Raleigh. Bernie Reeves magazine that I was working for at the time we did this, the research on the Raleigh Call and first published it, is located, Randy, was it about 4 blocks down, I think, at that time, from where Mr. and Mrs. Hurt were living. So they reached them and found out that John Hurt, in addition to an amazingly strange resume that he accumulated afterwards, was in fact a special agent for U.S. Army counterintelligence during World War II. And there's that word again from Richard Schweiker, intelligence. What Mrs. Treon recorded for history on her long-distance slip is that Lee Oswald requested to call a John Hurt, but what would become important is the fact that the John Hurt who had the first phone number on the slip was a former special agent in Army counterintelligence. In short, Oswald attempted to place a call from the Dallas jail to a member of the American intelligence community on Saturday evening, November 23rd, 63, but was mysteriously prevented from completing the call. Now, we have so many questions that come up as a result of that we need to examine about 3 different branches of this, and I can't do it in parallel form, even though it would be nice if we could get all of that. So excuse me while I go through each one of those branches separately. Could it be that one of the most interesting and potentially important aspects of the assassination of Kennedy may not have had anything to do with the murder itself? This story of the president's accused assassin attempting to place a call to a former member of American intelligence community has simmered on the back burner of the investigation since its discovery. This was the supposed lone nut with no connections to anyone, acting absolutely on his own, certainly not connected to any of American intelligence agencies or the mafia or anti-Castro Cubans or any of those things, according to the official version we got, and yet, somehow or another, he has a phone number to call a man who had worked in Army counterintelligence. And here's how we began to know and accumulate the information. Mrs. Treon, this is her history from that night on. She remained working in the Dallas switchboard, the Dallas Municipal Building switchboard, for several years. She then, with her family, moved back to her home area of Springfield, Missouri, set up their household there where she would stay until she passed away. And one night, 5 years later, this is 1968 now we're talking about, almost 5 years later, she's having a small dinner party with her husband, a couple of other family members, I believe, and a man by the name of Winston Smith, who actually himself has a fascinating resume, and he worked in law enforcement in a minor role there at that time in Greene County, Missouri. And she said, well, you know, the strangest thing happened on the night in the jail, the night after Oswald was arrested. Oh, you were there? Yes, I was. And she told the story that I just told you, probably in a little more detail. And Winston Smith said, wow, I'd never heard that before. I'm not sure in any of the readings that I've done on the Kennedy assassination anyone has ever even alluded to that. And she said, well, I've got the phone slip here if you want to see it. She brought it out, showed it to him. And he said, you know, this is above my pay grade. I think we should call the sheriff, who was known to be a very good guy, Sheriff Mickey Owen of Greene County. And he said, if you'd like, I'll contact him, get him over here. If he thinks there's something that should be done, fine. If not, you've only wasted a little bit of his time. She said, yeah, that's fine. I don't really care. Clearly, the woman was not seeking her 15 minutes of fame and fortune, because had she done so, she would have tried to do so before 1968. Sheriff came over. She told him the same story, filled in some gaps from what Winston Smith had told him, and he said, this is above my pay grade, or something to that effect. And he said, I think the FBI will want to know about this. And she, again, said, well, okay, whatever you think is best, I'm sure that's what's best. So he contacted the field office of the FBI there in Greene County. And she was soon visited by two members of the FBI field office there. And she told her story once again. And she mentions a little later in her testimony that they sat there and listened to it as if they had never heard anything like this ever before. And they tended to believe her when she brought out the phone slip. And they said, we want to take this with us, and we want to look into this and see what's going on with this. And she said, well, yeah, but I really want it back because it's kind of a family memento. Yes, of course, you will get it back. Spoiler alert, she did get it back, but it took her a while. So they take that off, and the story seems to die, except it didn't. Because at some point in early 1968, somebody that had a lot, but as it turns out, a lot of flawed information about Mrs. Treon's story and her testimony concerning the Raleigh Call, sat down and wrote and prepared a statement in proper affidavit form telling the story again, except with several glaring errors. And you would think that the next thing would happen if, in fact, the FBI or Sheriff Owen or whoever it was that actually prepared this, the next thing they would do would be to, if they're going to continue the investigation, take it over to Mrs. Treon, get her to sign it, get it notarized, get it into the evidentiary chain, and that's what would happen. It's not what happened. It would be 10 years before she ever knew that an affidavit like this even existed. And that's kind of on the next little train that we're going to follow out of the station in just a minute. But there it is. And all of the initial things, and it lists, by the way, that it has an attachment A, an appendix A, and the appendix A associated with the affidavit is, of course, the phone slip. All of the things that you see and read about in the early things that came out about the Raleigh Call, Canfield and Weberman's coup d'etat in America was the first, to my knowledge, and I think it is, in fact, the very first to put this in a published book. Followed up a few years later, I think maybe about 4 years later, by Anthony Summers' book Conspiracy, which is where I first ran across it, and saw the area code, was on a train. I was living in Connecticut at the time. I was on a train going from Hartford to New York City, was reading that book publisher had sent to me, asking me to review it, and I got to that page while the train was going toward New York, and I looked at that, oh, area code 919. I'm sure that'll come back to me in a minute. And of course, about 3 seconds later, oh yeah, that's my family's and my own area code back in North Carolina. So I sat up a little straighter and thought, when I got back to the house and read everything that was in Tony Summers' book, which was only about 3 or 4 paragraphs, I read it about 10 times before I got back, called Bernie Reeves, my friend, my mentor, and I said, just found out about this. Do you want another article? Do you want me to investigate it, see what I can find out? He said, do it. I'll publish whatever you write. He did. So in 1980, the first article of mine came out about the Raleigh Call. Now, and I mentioned that, Canfield and Weberman, Summers, my stuff in 1980, all of that is based on this affidavit and nothing else. That's the only evidentiary chain that there was at that time known to anyone. How did this get into the public sphere? Well, there's a very short and simple answer. Whoever wrote this, and my guess is that the people who interviewed her from the FBI went back, they're set up to write the affidavits like that based on witness testimony. Somebody sat down, took the agent's notes, wrote this up. And the first thing that seems to have happened is it was leaked to the press. Okay? And we know to whom it was leaked because there's another evidentiary chain based on letters that I have seen. It was sent to a man named Ian Calder, a reporter up in New York. He lived in New Jersey, worked out of New York City, for a national publication of great weight, ethos, gravitas, almost as high level as Garrison Journal. Get Garrison Journal if you don't get it. Let me just say that as a sideline. And of course, my tongue is firmly in my cheek when I say that about the first publication because it was in the National Enquirer. But it kind of, the presence of the affidavit, bad Xerox after bad Xerox after bad Xerox, it began to go around to people. That's in fact how Canfield and Weberman found out about it. And anything that came from that period is subject to all of the errors that the person made who wrote this. We would not know until Bud Finsterwall and his people sent this to the House Assassinations Committee and said, I think you're going to want to look into this. They actually had the original carbon that was made when that was typed up in Bud Finsterwall's files. And so I went there looking for it a few years ago, and I found it. And they still have it, but I've got a first-generation copy of the carbon. And but they sent a copy up to House Assassinations Committee, and to their credit, they said, wow, got to get on this. A special counsel by the name of Sorrell Brady, young lawyer, African-American lawyer. She's first-rate in every way, I'm told, in everything that she's done in her career since then. She lit out after this. She looked into it. She had a team. They went and interviewed everybody. And that's now the second layer of the evidence that we have. Because now, as of the mid-1990s, those files have been declassified and are now available through the National Archives. So it wasn't until 95, 98, 2000 that I was able to glean these articles, the new things, based on the quote-unquote new evidence from 1980, 78, 79, 80, and rewrite everything basically that I had written before and correct all the errors. And so here's what happened at that time. They sent a copy of this unsigned, unnotarized affidavit to Mrs. Treon out in Missouri, asked her, is this correct? Did you ever sign it? You know, will you verify the contents? And she wrote back and she said, I don't know who put this together. I've never seen this, but I can tell you the things that are wrong. I'm going to circle all the things that are wrong, and I'll write what's right in the margin. And she did, and that document exists. We have our own handwriting about what really happened, and it debunks some of the myths that had made people look very much askance at the Raleigh Call before. And so what I did, rather than trying to reproduce the bad copy of a bad copy of a bad copy of her handwriting, I just retranscribed everything. And so anything that's in purple brackets, she circled as being wrong. Anything that's in purple type is what she wrote in the margin to correct it. I just want to tell you these two things, and that's why I only reproduce this. In the affidavit, originally it said that Mrs. Swinney was the only one taking notes, or it implied that. She took down the notes about what Oswald wanted to do, who he wanted to call, tore it off when the call didn't go through, threw it in the wastebasket, and later, after Mrs. Swinney left to go home at the end of her shift, Mrs. Treon went and dumpster dived out of the trash can and found the information. Well, that really ticked Mrs. Treon off. You can tell by what she said. She was really offended that she would do that. And she, at that time, finally tells us about having listened in to everything that Oswald said. She said, I did not say that Mrs. Swinney threw the slip in the trash. I do not know what Mrs. Swinney did with her LD ticket. Then it says that comes the paragraph about her going into the trash can. She said, I did not say all this. I was asked if I knew what Mrs. Swinney did with her ticket. I said I had no idea. The tickets on long-distance calls not completed were not normally kept, but I did not know what she did with it. I heard Oswald placed the call, give his name, and I was on the line. So she goes through, gives all of those corrections, and at the very end of the presentation today, I've given you some links online where you can go and actually read that with my emendations and so forth from what she had to say. So that's all that's there. But errors in this have caused people to assume that it didn't exist. Paul Hoke, you all know Paul Hoke, distinguished researcher, great writer, and he was one of the first people that wrote to me after he read what I had written initially about that, and wrote me, she said, you know, be careful with this, it just doesn't smell right to me. I mean, the whole fact of going into the garbage can and getting out this, and you know, I think what happened was that this guy made a crank phone call into the jail, somebody wrote that down, threw it away, and when she went down to get the information, she got the information about the crank call, not about what Oswald was trying to call. Well, the new information pretty much puts that to rest, but a lot of wrong information is out there. I want to correct that for you today as kind of a new thing that I've added to this. You will find them. Mrs. Treon did not arrive early to relieve Mrs. Swinney. That's published in a book. I've seen it. Nope, she did not. She arrived, as I said, to be a replacement for another switchboard operator, and was expecting to be there during that whole time until 11 o'clock with Mrs. Swinney, which in fact she was. Mrs. Treon did not unplug after Mrs. Swinney took the call. Again, you got her own words for that now. Mrs. Swinney did not throw her LD slip into the wastebasket. All right, well, and therefore, Mrs. Treon did not retrieve the call from the trash. She wrote it herself. The signature on that that says L. Swinney was actually the handwriting of Mrs. Treon. Oswald spoke with Mrs. Swinney, and Mrs. Treon listened in. I've seen a reference that Oswald spoke to Mrs. Treon and they had this conversation. Didn't happen, small thing, still, it's wrong. This is now, we get into some things that are very important, which I just said. Mrs. Treon never saw the affidavit until 1978, and she never signed it. No one claims in any of this that Oswald spoke to John Hurt that day. And I bring this up because there is out there now an article online that's titled "The Raleigh Call That Did Not Happen." I was notified by this by Jim DiEugenio and 2 or 3 other people that had seen it before I ran across it, said, what do you make of this? And I pulled it down, I've looked at it. And the very first thing in that article says, I do not believe that Oswald made a call to Raleigh, let alone spoke to John David Hurt. And I looked at that and I said, I don't either. We agree. He didn't make the call because it didn't go through, and nobody's saying that he did talk to John David Hurt that day, because he didn't, because the call didn't go through, which is where we started this conversation. So again, be careful for those errors like that. If he's working under the assumption that we think they talked, no, we're not working under that assumption at all, because it didn't happen. And finally, and I've seen this everywhere, Oswald's call was not an attempt to reach the CIA. Now, that's a literal reading of this. He was attempting to call John Hurt, somebody we believe, this is a supposition, this is not fact, I can't prove this, but the supposition is that somebody gave him a name, a city, and said, if you get into trouble, call John Hurt in Raleigh, North Carolina. He'll get to us, we'll take care of you. And they did. But that's what he was attempting to do. Obviously, John Hurt was a member at one time of the intelligence community. He was special agent in U.S. Army counterintelligence, not the CIA. But I'll show you an example of how the desire for headlines sometimes can get you the wrong way round. There is, again, as I mentioned before, this wonderful national journal, which, and I say that facetiously, and yet they have published some amazing stuff. From time to time, every once in a while, maybe. And that's the National Enquirer. But they did do an article on the Raleigh Call not that long ago. And Stephen Jaffe is the author here. You'll know that name if you've looked into the Garrison investigation at all. He describes himself as the last surviving, living member of Garrison's investigation team. And he also worked with Mark Lane in trying to get Abraham Bolden pardoned and released from prison. So he's had a good resume along the line. He's an excellent writer. He contacted me. He says, I want to write this for the National Enquirer. He says, don't worry. I have told them that I won't write it unless I have absolute editorial control. They cannot change a word. And I said, well, okay, if you're happy with it, yeah, I'll help you make sure that you get everything right. What he didn't tell me was that the National Enquirer always reserves the right to write their own headlines and their own cover headlines. So on the cover and here at the top, we find out that he was a CIA spy. Okie dokie then. So now, back to the second track here. Oswald made several phone calls and attempted to make more during the day on Saturday. And I've just run across this through the research of Bart Camp. Again, many of you will know his work, especially the Prayer Man research that he's done. I'm actually very impressed with that. He found several affidavits from people who worked in the jail. And very, very quickly, I'm going to say that between 1:30 and 2 o'clock, he made, attempted to make a call that did not go through, whoever it was he was trying to call. About 4 o'clock, he asked to make a call again. Actually, he wanted to make 2 calls. And he was allowed, he was given free rein to the phone based on these affidavits all day long. One of the policemen said, well, anybody can make a phone call, of course, because Oswald assumed they wouldn't let him. He said, of course, anybody's allowed to make a call. Anytime you want to, let us know, we'll do that. Which I thought, you wouldn't put that in a movie if you were saying what the Dallas policeman had said. But nevertheless, that's what they said, and he did. And maybe it's just me. I've been doing the research here for 45 years on the Kennedy assassination. I never knew until 2 weeks ago when I saw this affidavit that on that afternoon, Oswald called someone. It went through, it was connected, and whoever it was he spoke to for 30 minutes. I did not know that. And it's in the records, apparently, because one of the people who did the affidavits looked later to see if, in fact, it had been written down correctly, and it had. 30 minutes. So anyway. Last of our little jaunts here across the evidentiary timeline. Who is John Hurt? Well, we know one thing, but whose telephone number was that other one? Well, House Assassinations Committee, if they did any work at all, they didn't document it. But a reporter in Raleigh, North Carolina, who worked for the News and Observer, the big, large regional newspaper there, did find out who the other one was, contacted him, and turns out that he was an older teenager at the time of the assassination. I think a high school graduate. He'd been working on his own in the automobile tire recapping industry, which is the way it was described. I guess he worked in a tire store. And after this report, I talked to him. Everybody pretty much came convinced that this was not, in fact, who Oswald would have been wanting to talk to. So why 2 phone numbers when only the first one was correct? Well, that 19-year-old automobile tire recapping guy's name was John Hurt. And these are the listings from the Raleigh telephone book for 4 years worth of telephone books. And I list these because when the House Assassinations Committee contacted the phone company and said, can you get us the records, all they had was, of course, the phone slip. And they said, can you tell us who these people were? And the lady came back and said, well, the company rules say we can't tell you that because they were unlisted at the time in 1963. Okay, are they unlisted now? Well, no, they're not unlisted now. Okay, so they're not unlisted now, so the people don't care if we know. Can you tell us? She had a real crisis of conviction at this point. Finally decided, well, it's okay. And so she gave him John David Hurt, which is our spy, and John William Hurt, who was the 19-year-old. And I thought, that's one of the craziest things I've ever seen. So I did a really simple piece of research, went to the phone books, and guess what? It was not unlisted. And why the phone company would say that to a governmental investigating body, I have no idea. But there they were. Both numbers were listed going back. I only went back as far as 61 and as far forward as the 64. So anyway, we know who these people are, and I know the name of the lady that told them the untruth. So one day I'm going to find her. John David Hurt. Very quickly, I want to just give you a little bit of his background. I talked to John Hurt a couple of years before he died, and he said he had no knowledge of any kind of phone call. Nobody called him. He didn't call anybody. He said, in fact, I was watching all the stuff at the time. He says, I was pretty much a Kennedy file myself. I loved the president. And he said, I would have been more likely to put a bullet in Oswald than I would be to talk to him or call him. And that's pretty much the same story that he gave to the House Assassinations Committee. He was born in 1909 in Colorado. He was 5'4", and if you want to know how tall that is, he had a law degree from the University of Virginia. We're not talking about a stupid man here. He never actually practiced law because he immediately went into the armed services, into the Army at the beginning of World War II, was put into special intelligence agency work. Came out of that, they wanted to give him a commission to make him a career officer. He turned that down, actually, after the war. Came back, married his wife, Billy Greer, and she was still alive and with him at the time that we were all trying to call him to find out what was going on. I won't go through reading all of his checkered career, but his life, his health, and his professional career did a spiral downward that kind of ended in '63, and then later when everybody started bothering him about the Raleigh Call. And his health never recovered. He was a raging alcoholic. He had been arrested for public drunkenness. He was investigated for making obscene and threatening phone calls to the Lieutenant Governor of North Carolina. At one time when the Vice President of the United States was coming through Raleigh, the FBI or the Secret Service, we're not sure which, came down and made sure that they knew where he was at the time that the Vice President was going to be somewhere else. So they had their eye on him. And again, all of this and so much more I have on my publication online, and it really is a page turner straight out of a spy novel. So now we come to the end here where we try to decide, is this an outgoing or an incoming call? And I'm sorry, I was looking away. What did you just hold up? Okay. I was told by Paul Hoke it must have been an incoming call. We think it was a crank call. And that was a lot of people who really smart and had a little bit of information to go on thought that was the case. But the House Assassinations Committee said, no, I don't think so. Toward the end of Hurt's life and after his death, he and his wife both stuck to their story, but then toward the end of her life, she told the family attorney that, well, you know, he was known for getting drunk, and I'll bet he picked up the phone, and I bet he called to the jail, and will that get me out of trouble? So their lawyer was very concerned that that was her concern. I put these two people's pictures and names up here for a reason, and that is Tony Summers. I talked to him as the very first person. Again, I saw it in his book Conspiracy, and I called him, had a long conversation with him, and he said, well, you know, I'm sorry I put it in the book. It just really doesn't smell right, and you know, all the things that I'd heard from other people. And I said, well, thank you very much. I appreciate that. And I put it aside. I was like, okay, I'll deal with that somehow. And about a week later, he called me back and he said, I'm sorry, I gave you wrong information. He said, apparently, I was wrong. He said, because I was just on the Today Show with Bob Blakey, former head of the House Assassinations Committee, and afterwards in the parking lot, we were just having a conversation, and the subject of the Raleigh Call came up. He said, I had just gotten a call from someone investigating that, and he says, and I told him I just didn't believe in it. And Blakey said, oh no, you've got that wrong. It really was real. It happened. We looked at it 5 ways from Sunday, and we're absolutely convinced that there's no way that this was fabricated. It actually happened in that it didn't happen. In other words, all the events that we said did occur, but the call never went through. And I did notice that when Summers republished the Conspiracy in the form of Not in Your Lifetime, he left out the Raleigh Call, and I'm just assuming that he went back to his former thoughts about that. We were also told by someone who didn't want to be quoted to contact Victor Marchetti, and gave us actually his home phone number, and said, if anybody knows about this, he'll know it and he'll tell you, because he'll tell anybody. So Bernie Reeves and I got on the phone, we called him, and he told us exactly what was going on in his mind. He said somebody made Oswald believe that John Hurt in Raleigh, North Carolina was his cutout. He says classic spycraft, and if you ever get in trouble, don't call us, call him, and he'll let us know and we'll come and verify you. And I asked him during the interview if by calling John Hurt, if Oswald had signed his own death warrant, and he says, you betcha. Marchetti also told me about the OSI, the Naval Intelligence base down in Nag's Head, where they were known to be training people from the military to act as defectors to the Soviet Union in the hopes that they would be picked up as double agents. And he says that's what Oswald was doing. And he said, and the fact that John Hurt and Nag's Head are in the same state, he said, I think that means something. I've never found a connection, but it is true. And Tosh Pumley has told us several times that he saw Oswald there at the Nag's Head base. And so to the extent that his memory and recognition is correct, then that's one more nail in the coffin of this story. I won't go terribly far into it, but of course there is the intelligence story of Antonio Veciana, the former anti-Castro Cuban brigade leader, reporting having seen just days before the assassination Lee Oswald in a bank talking with Veciana's own CIA handler, a man he knew as Maurice Bishop, but we came to know later was David Atlee Phillips, who would become the Western Hemisphere chief of the CIA. Fast forwarding to 2014, when I was speaking at the 50th anniversary conference for the publication of the Warren Report, the widow of Gaten Fonzie was there, brought Vesiana and his sons and other people with him, and he read a document. Actually, he wrote and his son read a document where he said, I want to unequivocally state that Maurice Bishop was David Atlee Phillips. I was sitting here where this gentleman, or actually where this lady was sitting. I was on the front row when he read that. And I later was able to get the actual copy of the statement with Vesiana's and his son's handwritten notes and emendations in it. So I have that in my files. So we have all of these tantalizing little things that add up back to what Richard Schweiker had to say about the fingerprints of intelligence. But let's just take one last look at the credibility of the Raleigh Call. James Douglas, everybody has great respect for this book, and rightfully so. He believes absolutely, as the House Assassinations Committee believed, that it had full accuracy. And then, just for information, this comes from the report that was written by Sorrell Brady about this, and she said, skipping down to the bottom, the allegation that Oswald was calling John David Hurt is disturbing because the committee has found no evidence that Mrs. Treon had any motive to invent the story, especially with such precise details as the actual phone number listed to John David Hurt. When I first got invited to come to this conference by Judith, she first asked me if I would speak at the Knoll yesterday, at Dealey Plaza, and I said that would be an honor. I've never done that, and of course. She later switched it to this event, and which is perfectly fine. But what I was going to do in the shorter form at the Knoll was to talk about one issue that has been bothering me. And he just flashed that I've got 5 minutes, and I'm going to use 3 of them for this. I've been concerned in my 45 years of working on the research in the assassination that we had a gold standard that was raised for us by people such as Mark Lane, Sylvia Marr, Dr. Wecht, Mary Farrell, Gaten Fonzie. And please note, there are, of course, others, including in this room, there are those who would be in the gold standard, but let's use those above as examples. We are being watched, and I don't just mean in a clandestine way. I don't just mean by CIA infiltrators. We are being watched for what we do in our community. And to the extent that we do it as well as these people and others like them did it, we will be judged as having good, solid information that the public should take notice of. And to the extent that we put out sloppily researched, badly written, poorly documented research with absurd conclusions, it doesn't help anybody. So having worked for 30 years in a university teaching students all the things on the right side of that line, let me just run through them. And this is just a call for you to look at yourself and how you do your work. And I believe these are the checkoff points that you will want to follow, and your work can be up there with the greats. And that starts with, start with the facts and end with the conclusions. How many times have you seen something that clearly started with a conclusion? I think this should be the case, and I'm going to find all the evidence I can to support it. I'm going to leave out all the other evidence. Be accurate, exhaustive, impartial, persistent, and always modest. That really describes these 5 people. And if you look back to everything you know about the work that they did, you'll see that all of those apply to them, and you can use their example to make sure that your work has the same quality to it. Work tirelessly, being passionate about job one, the truth. That's all that matters. Being up here to speak is good. It's wonderful. It's a great thing. Publishing something is good. But the ultimate goal is the truth. And if you don't put that as job one, everything else will be suspect afterward, and the people who read your work will understand that that's the way it was. Actively gather all facts, not just those that fit a theory. Explain things the way you learned them. That's the easiest way. I used to wonder, how should I teach this thing that I've never taught before? All right, how did I learn it? All right, yeah, I remember I learned this and I learned this, and that's how I would teach it. How did you learn about the Raleigh Call? What were the steps? What questions did you have at the time? Well, answer those as you write about the Raleigh Call. Seek out perspectives from those with whom you disagree. Period. I think you know what I'm talking about. Document everything, record, and cite sources. Always. One of the things that so struck me about Mark Lane is the story where he submitted Rush to Judgment, and a publisher looked at it and took it to his editorial thing and said, check every footnote. And they checked every footnote, and they were all real, and they all were accurate. And they said, let's publish this book. Assert only what you've proved, and suggest that which you haven't. Be giving, share always, mentor freely, and do everything honestly. The larger picture, very quickly. The media, don't give them ammunition against us by what you do, what you write, what you say about other researchers, anything. The powers out there, you know who I'm talking about, let them see that we have our act together, that truth is the only thing we're going after. The public, fill your words with fervor for the truth. They will respond. Young people will never stand for shoddy logic or incomplete facts, so don't expect them to. And finally, one of my favorite quotes ever from Dr. Peter Kreeft, be egalitarian regarding persons. We're all equally important in God's eyes. Be elitist regarding ideas. There are just some ideas that rise to the top, and be elitist that way, and your work will always be regarded as the great gold standard of our system. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Ladies and gentlemen, Grover Proctor.